if everybody wants to come in and sit down, Dr. Meldrum is going to give a presentation. Dr. Meldrum, I can't say enough about the man. He came up last year, did 2 days worth of presentations, come up and sit at the campfire with us. I mean, it was a really great experience. Randy was really wanting to introduce him, but I think Randy went back up on the ridge. So, but Dr. Meldrum is going to do a presentation, and folks, the man knows his business. Last year when he was giving his presentation, everybody was glued to their seats. So I'm going to turn it over to him, let him get started.
Well, this is just a little impromptu. We weren't sure how this particular hour was going to go, but I came here from Indianapolis, and so I had to have an extra canned presentation that we'll just draw upon, which is formatted basically as an F.A.Q, frequently asked questions. So, invariably, one of the questions that I'm continually confronted with is, well, do you believe in Sasquatch? And I often resort to, as you may individually as well, to a little a lecture. The professorial side of me comes out, I guess. And when people use that term belief, especially given the stigma that's often associated with this subject matter in the press and media, they have in their mind, whether they realize it or not, the connotation that this is a position of faith, of accepting something in the absence of evidence, or at least in the absence of conclusive evidence. And my argument is continually that, there are questions, but we have lots of evidence. It's like one of my previous department chairman chided me one time. He was never very supportive of my interests along this line of research, and he chided me one time and said, well, after all, Jeff, these are just stories. And I said, well, stories that leave tracks, that shed hair, that void scab, that are seen by dozens of hundreds of credible witnesses under very good conditions of observation. I said, there's a little more substance there than just stories. If it was just stories, we could probably just dismiss it fairly readily, but we have all this other inconvenient evidence that has to be dealt with. There we go. So where did the idea of Sasquatch start? Now, obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here. Most of you are quite versed in this, but I find it rather amazing that invariably, especially in recent publications that have come out by self-professed experts who decided to write a book about Bigfoot for one reason or another. There were 2 books that have come out recently that I've been asked to review. One by Booz, was published by the University of Chicago Press, called Bigfoot, The Life and Times of a Legend, and another that I'm just finishing up the review on, Michael McLeod's McLeod or McLeod, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, who is a journalist, producer, writer, who's done some documentaries for various networks. And he took an interest and wrote a book that was published by the University of California Press. So 2 academic presses have recently written or published books about Bigfoot that are essentially efforts to debunk the subject by self-professed experts. And in both of them, they invariably hark back to 1958 as the origin of Sasquatch, Bigfoot. But of course we know that the idea of such an animal, such a creature, predates that time by millennia, probably. The indigenous populations of this continent were aware of the existence of these beings and incorporated them into their worldview, into their stories, into into their traditional knowledge. This is a picture of what I can only interpret as a Sasquatch track that was carved into the red sandstone, the red cliffs in southern Wyoming, in the Wind River Range. And that interpretation, in fact, this was pointed out to me by one of the state archaeologists in Wyoming, who's taken quite a fascination with this subject after some extensive interaction with elders of the Eastern Shoshone tribe in assisting him to interpret some of the petroglyphs that he has been documenting. But in contrast to the depiction of the human footprints, which have a very characteristic stylized hourglass outline and a curved toe row and bigger big toe, this seems to portray the very distinguishing characteristics that we associate with Sasquatch tracks. The relative length to breadth, or breadth to length being increased. The toes disposed much more squarely across the end of the foot. There's even a very distinctive hint of a pressure ridge across the mid part of the foot that I found particularly interesting. Doesn't show up really well in this photograph, which didn't have enough strong side lighting to illustrate that. But of course, the Native Americans have depicted such a creature in their native art. Although highly stylized, they still incorporate some fundamental anatomical features that distinguish this being from other beings in their representation of the natural world. And so the grimacing face of the Bukwas is very characteristic facial expression found in primates because of the highly developed muscles of facial expression. The female counterpart, the Zonaqua, is typically depicted with the lips in a pursed posture. Pardon me. I find this really interesting too because the distinguishing characteristics of this male and female counterpart of these wild people of the woods has to do with postures of the mouth. And when you look at the various facial expressions that, for example, chimpanzees are capable of, and the way those who study facial nonverbal communication categorize the facial expressions and their interpretation for the great apes, much of the difference has to do with the posture of the lips, the degree to which the teeth are bared, and so forth. So it's interesting that the Native Americans focused in on those particular features in such a way. Some of the depictions are very lifelike. This is one you've probably seen that John Green has drawn attention to, and other authors in their books previously, and I discuss it in my book. It resides in the Peabody Museum of Natural History, remarkably lifelike in its depiction, with the exception of that one detail. The eye tooth, the canine, is not projecting, and instead is evened off with the remainder of the teeth. Now, if you look at a Gigantopithecus, as for at least for the moment, a working hypothesis for an ancestral candidate for Sasquatch, one of the distinguishing features of Gigantopithecus, in contrast to other apes, is that the canines wear off tip to tip until they're, in the adults, they're even with the other teeth. Now, is that just a coincidence that this native depiction of a giant ape shows a dentition that agrees with the only other known giant ape in a very distinctive way? I don't know. Maybe. Here we are up looking at some rock art outside of a canyon, or outside of a ranch, in a canyon on the eastern slopes of the Wind River Range. John Myanzinski is down in the lower left. He's my principal field collaborator, a wildlife biologist from Wyoming. And behind us is Fred Chapman, who was one of the state archaeologists in Wyoming for many years, and now teaches at the University of Wyoming. And one of the things that we looked at on this particular trip, this area was quite interesting because it was a site of repeated encounters by the ranch owners with Sasquatch. And up on the side was, amongst many other interesting depictions of Native American activities, Shoshone piece of art that was unfortunately nearly damaged beyond recognition. But you can see that the neck is about right here, which suggests that the torso is very, very broad and thick. The arms are upraised, displaying these large, exaggerated 5-fingered hands. And then down here you can see that there's a foot off to the side. Now, in contrast to this depiction, all of the human depictions, the depictions of humans, that is, are basically stick figures. They rarely have any thickness through their torso or their limbs. They're drawn, much like a very simplified stick figure fashion. Now, there's another illustration that comes from a costume from a British Columbian coastal tribe that depicts the Sonoqua. And what struck me when I saw this, after having seen the rock art, was the convergence in these over-exaggerated hands held aloft to display the 5 fingers. It seems to me that the native artists are attempting again to exaggerate, to draw attention to a particular feature that distinguishes this being from so many others that are out there in nature. And what could be more distinguishing than a very human-looking hand compared to the paws or hooves of all the other wildlife that they are familiar with. So here, widely separated and yet remarkably convergent. The Washington State Historical Society did an exhibit recently, and it lasted for about a year. It was on forests, but it was particularly focusing on the, quote, denizens of the forest, the wild man of the woods. And they commissioned a native artist to depict Sonoqua. Now, the Sonoqua is also known as the cannibal woman. She is notorious for luring children out with her high-pitched whistling call. And if she finds wayward children, she snatches them up, throws them into this wicker basket on her back, and takes them off, intending to eat them up for dinner. But usually she's a little bit slow, and her wicker baskets are quite crude, and so the children are usually able to pick their way out of the bottoms and slip away and escape before. But just a quick anecdote. I don't remember if I talked about this last year or not, but when I was doing work in southern Colorado, a colleague of mine, we were at her home, and while we were waiting to take care of the business that night, I was perusing her extensive book on natural history of Colorado and so forth. And there was a book on the native traditional stories of Colorado. And there was a story called La Llorona, Spanish for the wailing woman, apparently, or the wild woman. And the story went that a woman lost her children who were drowned in a flash flood. She was so bereaved that she had a mental breakdown and ran into the wilderness and became wild, grew hair, covering of hair, and was reportedly wandering the creek bottoms and riverways in search of her lost children. And she would wail, and so at night, people would hear this wailing call out in the river bottoms, attributed to her. She was said to walk around with a basket on her back and would snatch up wayward children that were out after dark and throw them in and take them off into the wilderness to replace her lost children. Now, what are the odds, again, of these two stories being so similar, so convergent, down to a wailing woman calling out at night and with a high-pitched wail and having a basket on her back to capture children? Well, we in Indianapolis, the theme of that night was the theme of their exhibit was looking at the interplay of art and science, and they had artistic depictions of Bigfoot, and they invited the public to submit their own impressions of what Bigfoot looked like. So can you hit the backup button for me? I included here a native, well, there we go, thank you. A good friend of mine in Blackfoot, north of Pocatello, on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. He is also an artist and frequently depicts Sasquatch themes, or as they call it, the Zouavich, the lost brother, or also the eater of children. And this was one of his depictions where he shows that he calls it the visitor. and you can see the line of footprints leading over to the snow outlined silhouette in the tree line. The one that I wanted to include that he wasn't able to get me a digital image of in time, he's depicted a brave in native regalia, astride, bareback astride a horse, and it's the same sort of weather with the gray sky and the snow filtering down, and the brave's peering over the side of his horse, looking at these gigantic footprints in the snow leading off the edge of the photograph. But what's more interesting is the horse is wide-eyed, the white showing, and ears pricked forward, and the breath coming as he peers off in the direction that the footprints are leading, because he can see what's the footprint maker off in the distance. So it's kind of fun. You probably have seen this, appeared in Argosy magazine. It's a depiction of William Rowe's account of encountering a Sasquatch. It also is pertinent here because it also predates 1930s or 1958. This was back into, I think, the date escapes me, in the early 1930s, late 1920s, when William Rowe claimed that he was out prospecting and encountered a female Sasquatch. Critics have looked at this kind of depiction and said, well, this is what inspired Roger Patterson. Roger had redrawn this picture, this illustration, in his little booklet, Do Almost No Man in America Really Exist? And they said this was the inspiration for Patty, right down to the posture, the arm swinging, the pendulous breasts, and so forth. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to assume that. And then Robert Bateman depicted a Sasquatch here. This was commissioned by Beautiful BC Magazine and accompanied an article written by Professor John Bindernagel, about the state of the evidence for Sasquatch in the province of British Columbia. But again, trying to capture that essence of there, but not completely there, as is suggested by the veiling mist. Okay, how did I get involved with this subject? Well, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. My grade school years were spent in Spokane, Washington. While I was there, in 1968, Roger Patterson came to the Spokane Coliseum with his documentary showcasing the Patterson-Gimlin film clip. And so that was my first exposure to this piece of film footage. Roger came out on stage afterward and answered questions and passed out literature on how to order his book. So that's my well-tattered and dog-eared copy of Do Almost No Man of America Really Exist? When I would take that to school to read during the reading hour, it always got quite a reaction from fellow students. Somebody even sent me a clipping. It was Chris Murphy, actually, sent me the clipping of the actual advertisement that had appeared in the Spokesman Review. I think it was a Spokesman Review in Spokane, I may be confusing that, but where it shows the Spokane Coliseum. But it wasn't until much later that my academic career sort of brought me around full circle. And it was in 1996 that I was taken into the foothills outside of the Blue Mountains, near Walla Walla, Washington, and shown a line of tracks. You can see indicated by the yellow arrows. We've already put up some plaster in a couple of them. But these were very clear footprints. I mean, there was no mistaking. They were either Sasquatch tracks or they were hoaxed. There was no mistaking them as bear tracks or anything like that. They particularly caught my attention because this one had this distinctive feature. This looks kind of like a speed bump here, a pressure ridge across the midfoot there. And this one was even more dramatic, although inundated with water. The step had extruded mud here from the midfoot, so you can see the heel back here, pressure under the forefoot had extruded mud into the bag. Clear evidence of the presence of the mid-tarsal break in the footprints. There were also numerous half tracks exemplified in many of these prints. And by a half track, what I mean is when the creature was striding out longer than a step, it was either loping or running, its heel was elevated, Didn't leave any impression back there. All there is a little bit of extrusion that you can see right here, but no heel impression behind. So just the forward part of the foot, but lacking the longitudinal arch, the foot collapses into flexion through the midfoot, and during the running leaves an impression of the entire forefoot rather than just fall of the foot. Again, this could only be accounted for if that foot exhibits a much greater degree of midfoot flexibility than is present in a modern human. Now, if there's any skeptics in here, as there are in some groups, when it's a more of a public forum, but didn't somebody confess that on their deathbed that they hoaxed all the Bigfoot tracks with carved wooden feet? And if a picture could speak 1,000 words, you would think that this would be the story right here. Here's the end all, right? Basically, if his expression says it all, like, you dummies, we fooled you for 40 years. And you may or may not know the story of Ray Wallace. This is not Ray, but his nephew. And here he's displaying two sets of tracks, or a set of tracks, carved wooden tracks, that the family claimed upon Ray's death were responsible for many, along with other sets that were made, for virtually all of the footprints that had been found from British Columbia to California over the past number of decades. And you can see the ridiculously simplistic leather harnesses that these were supposedly attached to the feet of the hoaxer. When challenged, how did they accomplish the increased stride length then to correlate with these longer feet? They said, oh, it's simple. We just put the fake feet on and then had someone drive the pickup truck, and you just hold on to the tailgate and it would kind of pull you along. You'd just give these bounding leaps. So apparently it was demonstrated on one of the local televisions, and after about 2 steps, the ridiculously simplistic harnesses slipped, and the person caught his toe and went right into the burrow head. What I saw firsthand on television that I thought was even funnier is the reporter telling the story, standing out in a muddy field with these wooden feet on. And he's standing there for a few minutes telling the story, and then he goes to turn and walk away. Well, if any of you, even with large boots, rubber boots, have stepped in a mud puddle or in wet mud, you know what happened. You can imagine with these big snowshoe-ish wooden feet, he turned and almost fell head first, and then he pulled one foot up, and there was 3 inches of mud. It was like when Darren pulled up these casts from the dirt. There was 3 inches of mud stuck to the bottom of the wooden foot, and what was left, the camera zooms in on the quote footprint, and it was just a big crater in the mud. There wasn't any detail whatsoever, so it was extremely laughable. And then, of course, when compared to the cast made by Jerry Crew, they seemed to be oblivious to the fact that it was the wrong size, let alone the wrong shape, and had very little to do with it. I like this photograph even better. This one was taken by a couple of reporters from the Humboldt Times that went up and examined fresh footprints and made a cast of their own. And this one shows some real dynamics of the toes, even more so than Jerry Crew's print, that still by the same individual. No question this is that same 17-inch foot, but the toes are actually, in my opinion, more animated, and you can barely make it out here. Granted, this is a reprint of a newsprint article, but there's a stick that extends across here that was edited in the photograph of the print itself before the capsule was made, and that stick protrudes up into where the surface of the foot, the undersurface of the foot, some distance. So the soft sole of the foot accommodated that stick without pressing it down into the ground. If this track was made by this wooden foot, it would have high-centered on that stick and just teeter-tottered back and forth and eliminated most of the detail. So the footprints by far represent, in my opinion, the most pervasive and the most compelling evidence that there is something out there. You just cannot tell me that some clan of Wallaces wearing ridiculously carved wooden feet are responsible for all of these tracks all across the states. In fact, to help demonstrate that, one of the projects that we've undertaken, I've undertaken, with assistance from some other funding sources, we've created a 3D virtual archive of footprints. And this has been a long time in seeing culmination. We've got about 180 footprints scanned, including some comparative material. I just now need to get together with the technician to create the web portal. And then these will be available to examine by the public as well as academics. But for example, I took a technician down to the Willow Creek Museum, and we executed 3D scans of all the original cast material from Titmus's collection. And that's all included, including the 10 tracks from the Patterson-Gimlin film site. And the scans are stunning. They're just really amazing. These are just stills, but they can be dropped down into a 3D viewer and rotating in three-dimensional space in real time. The highlights can be brought out with a movable illumination point and so forth. We can render them as topographic maps. We can do superpositions. We can do areas, angles, linear measurements, everything quantitative. If the curators at the Smithsonian decide they want to do an exhibit on the Sasquatch tracks, they can download these files to their in-house prototyper and fabricate perfect replicas at any scale they want, in any material they want. We had one of our machine shops on campus actually milled some 3D scans of horse cannon bones for an exhibit on horse footprints through time, the evolution of horse tracks, and they had, in conjunction with that, they had an exhibit on farrier skills. But they milled these out of stainless steel, these beautiful replicas of foot bones out of stainless steel. What is the mid-tarsal break? You know, a lot of people are using that term now that I've put it out there, but to reiterate very briefly, and Darren, wave the flag at any point that you want me to.
I just need to change tape real quick.
Do you want to change tape?
Yeah.
Okay. There's what appears to be a pressure ridge in the tarsus, and then a rather elongate heel. If you had seen this, and I didn't tell you that it was Homo erectus, but said, here's an example of a Sasquatch track that was found in Washington State last week, you'd accept it because it looks that remarkably similar to other tracks that we've true to Sasquatch. So it seems that, and this has been one of the themes of my research, is that up until modern humans, hominids have walked on flat, flexible feet. And there's been a lot of resistance to this because the people who promoted the Laetoli tracks originally described them as, and these are tracks attributed to Australopithecus afarensis 3.5 million years ago.
Is that Lucy?
Lucy, exactly. They said her feet looked just like little people, little modern humans walking in the ash. And so I went to Hawaii and looked at native Hawaiian footprints in volcanic ash that had a remarkable consistency, or a similar consistency to that of the East African ash, based on extrusion and other features that were there, let alone the chemistry and so forth. And they clearly look very, very different than the Laetoli tracks. So then they finally had to back off a little bit because their caveat was, well, they were walking in this big, thick, gloppy ash, that's why they look a little different, but essentially they're modern humans, and modern human in appearance. And I'd say, well, no, they're not. Here's modern humans, and here's what they look like, and these don't look anything like that. These look like chimpanzees that lack a divergent big toe. So, let's see, there was one other thing I was going to say there, and I lost it. It'll come back as we go along. So the mid-tarsal break, well, where did that begin? If we go back to apes, their adaptation is tree climbing, up vertical supports particularly. And so the foot has this dual function. The front part is prehensile, it grabs onto the substrate with this divergent big toe, enlarged to oppose the other digits. But then in order to free up the back part of the foot, the leverage portion or the propulsive part, the joints in the midfoot remain very flexible. Whereas in humans, those joints have stiffened. They screw in a much limited range of motion. They screw into a locked, stable position, so that as the heel elevates, the foot becomes stiff and has a rigid longitudinal arch. And this way, the entire foot acts like a lever, with the fulcrum, the pivot point, being way down here. And having the length of the lever here, humans have shortened the heel and developed this massive Achilles tendon. It's an elastic storage mechanism that's loaded every time we run. So humans are an endurance walking running machine. Sasquatch, on the other hand, seems to have retained this midfoot flexibility such that when the heel comes up, the pressure is now concentrated under the entire forefoot, not just the ball of the foot. The fulcrum, at least during the first part of the step, is right here. And so since the lever's shortened with increased body mass, we increase leverage by lengthening the calcaneus. So one of the characteristics of Sasquatch tracks is this elongated heel. And this is where Grover tried to explain it, but he confused people, unfortunately, because he said the ankle was moved forward. Well, it's hard to imagine how you move an ankle bone forward. It's much easier to just picture it. It's the heel bone is longer. Therefore, the ankle bone appears to be shifted forward. It's not moved. It's just that the heel's longer, and that displaces the Achilles tendon from the shin bone back here a little further, so that when the leg is swinging and that muscle is relaxed, the tendon becomes a little slack, and then you get what you see on the Patterson-Gimlin film. When she's bringing her foot forward, you get this very prominent heel sticking up that the critics say, oh, there's a fake foot. You can see the false foot extends beyond the heel of the actor. Or you get some ridiculous comment like that from Dr. David Daglin, who says that the costume is so ridiculous, they've attached the Achilles tendon forward on the heel bone in an unnatural place. Or it appears that way. Doesn't make any sense at all. Okay. So this adaptation then allows the toes to be considerably longer, because the toes in humans are used much more forcefully in push-off because the weight's concentrated here at the base of the toes. So humans have experienced selection pressure through evolution for greatly shortened toes, whereas the Sasquatch toes are longer. Now, there was a point that came out in conversation where it helped me to maybe explain this better. When I say the toes, I'm talking about the skeleton of the toe. In the lateral toes, there are 3 bones, just like in your fingers. And the big toe, there's 2, just like in your thumb. Those are called phalanges, and that constitutes the toe. But even with your hand, the palm, the webbing of the palm extends up past those joints, well along the length of the first set of bones in your fingers. So when you flex your fingers, what happens to your palm there? There's a crease that runs right across the end of your palm. And if you look at Patty's foot, if you go out there and look at the cast of the Patterson film subject, you'll notice where that crease is present. There's a little indentation in the middle of the ball of the foot. And her toes, although the exposed part of her toes look short and stubby, like peas in a pod, if you look at the length all the way down to that crease, they're pretty long. Well, look at her toes here when she walks, and they point up to the sky. Right there. Those toes are pretty long. They're not short little stubby peas in a pod, they're very long. But the sole pad comes up quite far. Also, you can see the mid-tarsal break. It's partly obscured by some of the topography, but right at this point, right there, you can see for an instant the heel is almost vertical. If that foot were stiff and as an extension of that heel, the foot would be sticking 6 inches into the sand, in spite of any obscuring topography. So there clearly is a flexion that's occurring at that mid-tarsal region. I mean, that can't be any more vivid. You know, I mean, if someone can't see that, then they don't appreciate the underlying anatomy. They don't understand the argument at all. And I've kind of gone around in circles. There's somebody on one of the blogs, and one of the participants keeps bringing it back to my attention. He says he cannot see the mid-tarsal break on the Patterson film. Well, then he just doesn't know what a mid-tarsal break is. He doesn't know what he's looking at. I mean, there's a point where you just finally have to say, okay, you can't see it, fine. Go do something else, you know. But if you plot the relative position or the relative lengths of the toes, taking the metatarsals as sort of as a standard length here in black, and well, I'm sorry, taking this whole length rather as a standard scale here, and then we depict the relative contribution of that length from the tarsals versus the metatarsals, and then tack the toes on. You see that on average, and again, this is inferential. We have to kind of infer these lengths from the footprints and the landmarks that are visible there. The toes are about intermediate in length between Lucy here, Australopithecus afarensis, or gorilla, if that evokes a better image, and humans. So Lucy's a primitive biped, walking on two legs. She's experienced shortening of her toes. And the Sasquatch toes are even shorter because it's larger, greater body mass, more stress on those digits, so they're a little bit shorter. But still, Sasquatches retain, especially if you consider that this is a little bit skewed because the elongated heel of the Sasquatch makes this look a little bit relatively shorter than it really is, absolutely. That foot of the Sasquatch still has a tremendous amount of prehensile capability. So why? Why would the Sasquatch foot have this adaptation? Well, humans followed a very different path. They followed a path where they were in the lowlands, they were open plains, hunters, and so forth, and their foot has evolved for endurance, walking and running over distances, over flat terrain, pretty much. Sasquatch, on the other hand, has remained in the mountainous forest habitat, where the terrain is up and down, up and down. It doesn't climb up trees, so it doesn't need that divergent big toe, because body mass prohibits that. But it's climbed up a steep mountainside where grasping digits, longer grasping digits, and flexible midfoot. You know, think about when you try to climb up a steep hillside, especially if you're in boots, stiff boots. You have to kind of dig your toes in to gain purchase, and your foot sticks out away from the hillside. Their foot, on the other hand, could conform to that irregular, broken surface with tree trunks and so forth to a much greater degree. The thing that is absolutely, though, convincing to me is the presence of the half-tracks. There's no way to get a deep half-track impression like this unless the foot can bend across the midfoot. There's just no way to explain that otherwise. And there's multiple examples, very credible. The ones in the preceding picture were from the tracks that I examined outside of Walla Walla in '96. These were tracks that were documented by Deputy Sheriff Dennis Hereford in Grace Harbor County back in the early '70s. And again, they show the half-track really nicely. And even here you can see the bulge for the head and the base of the fifth metatarsal, and then another bulge right here that corresponds to the transverse tarsal joint. And you can see that in many human feet. If you had some people, took a sample of you and had just stepped in a bucket of water and walk on this flat cement, you'd see this same kind of outline. This wouldn't be as exaggerated. This suggests some pathology, some arthritis in the joints. But this position of this joint is, or the appearance of this joint would be very similar, although here the appearance or the placement position is more distal because of the elongated heel. But the termination of this half track falls right there, right at the correct point. I mean, there's too many convergent observations for this to be coincidental. The elongated heel displaces the calcaneal tendon from the shin bone, as I mentioned, and that trend is observable in other primates. If we look at increasingly large and increasingly terrestrial apes, from chimp to lowland gorilla to mountain gorilla to Sasquatch, we see an increase in length and breadth of the calcaneus. We see a shortening of the lateral digits. We see a decrease in divergence and an increase in size of the great toe or the hallux. So So the Sasquatch track, it isn't just an enlargement of human tracks, and it isn't just something bizarre that just poof is there with no context. It's a natural extension of trends that are very evident amongst the small sample of living. I'm going to jump past. This is the Laetoli track. Here's with a skeletal reconstruction by a different investigator, a different researcher. I've highlighted the transverse tarsal joint or the mid-tarsal joint in red. You can see its coincidence with a ridge that appears in this footprint, and this one absolutely nailed it for me and for some other researchers who were questioning my interpretation of this as a pressure ridge, because this is a flow front, nice and rounded, of the wet ash being extruded from underneath the forefoot into the heel, and it falls at exactly the same position at the transverse tarsal joint there. Here's that Homo erectus footprint. You can see the concavity here. The shadow falls across a nice, smoothly concave surface. There's no differentiated ball, no hourglass shape. This is not an arch, but it's an extrusion front of material pushed back here. And there's an elongated heel here. That looks an awful lot like one of the tracks from the Patterson-Gimlin film site that exhibits that pressure ridge remarkably clearly. Okay. How much longer?
I think I'll have to make it back. Just keep on going.
Keep on going for the moment? Okay. All right, so a lot of my argument has been based on the Patterson-Gimlin film, and right, there have been stories that repeatedly circulate and surface. Isn't that notorious film Just a Man in a Fursuit? One of the books I reviewed is one by called The Anatomy of the Beast by Michael McLeod. Is remarkably biased, and it from the very outset he starts his argument with the assumption that it is hoax, and therefore everything is bent to that thesis. But obviously the latest claim, and it's only the latest, each time one of these things comes up, they have a short shelf life, and what it does is it simply turns our attention back to the film oftentimes with newer technologies to evaluate it more critically than before. So first, Bob Hieronymus claimed that he was the man in the fursuit. This isn't the first time he's claimed it. He did it anonymously a number of years back, and then eventually withdrew that claim or let it die on the vine. But when he had Philip Morris sort of back him up, Philip Morris owns a costume company back here somewhere in the east, in Carolinas or somewhere. It is the company that produces the majority of off-the-shelf gorilla costumes that you can get. This being his typical gorilla costume, the one that he suggested was the basis for this film. He said he saw this on television and immediately recognized this as one of his costumes. Well, I think he maybe needs a pair of glasses or something, or his prescription checked. It doesn't look very obvious to me that that's the case. He did acknowledge that Roger must have re-engineered the feet because the standard model has a divergent big toe like a gorilla. When they were challenged to show how one of Morris's costumes could be responsible, it took them about 8 months to reverse engineer something, including this head, and they had to attach the appropriate appendages here and remodel the feet, and this was the result. They did a little blurring to the image and so forth, and this is Bob Hieronymus, and I've shown them to scale, and this is a modest scale. Here I left Patty at about 6.5 feet, which was where Grover had kind of placed the height at the maximum. But I'll point out that probably was wrong. But it, you can use your imagination and see how convincing that would look if it was in motion. They were going to produce they got Cal Korff involved, who's another famous, quote, debunker, and they were going to produce a big documentary debunking all this, but the process quickly degenerated, and there were threats of suits and countersuits, lawsuits, not ape suits. And they all ended up going their own ways with nothing to show for it. Bob Hieronymus supposedly had this very funny kind of walk when he walked. And everyone said, look, just like the Sasquatch, just like the Patterson film. And tomorrow I'll talk about this in much more detail. Tomorrow my talk will be focused on the Patterson film. But you can see that Hieronymus has a body build that's kind of distinctive. He has rather high hips, long legs for his height. This is a sketch of him taken from a photograph he wouldn't allow to be reproduced except in Greg Long's book. But if you scale Patty to his arm length, then she's way too short, because her arms are, in the film, are noticeably long. If you scale her, however, to his leg length, and just take the knee to foot length, then she's way too big, because her legs are relatively small to her overall proportions. You know, and his eyes would be down about here, and then those appendages would be in the way. You wouldn't be able to see anything. So, of course, Jeff Glickman from NASI did a professional job of superimposition using a photograph that was taken by Peter Byrne. This is Al Hodgson's son, who's about 6'2" tall. And you can see, I mean, the thing that's the most impressive is not only the difference in the height that's evident in these superimpositions, but the difference in the girth. I mean, the thickness through the torso. These thighs are as big around as his waist almost. So it's pretty impressive. We did, one of the documentaries that I was involved with provided a really fun opportunity, and they arranged for an analysis to be conducted at Stanford University. And they recruited 2 people who are top-notch in their fields. This is Dr. Dennis Gamble, who's an orthopedic surgeon, and Dr. Jessica Rose, who is a PhD in human biomechanics. And she runs the gait lab associated with the Lucille Children's Hospital at Stanford University. And Dr. Gamble then works with her, refers patients that have a gait problem, suffering from various maladies. National Geographic did this, and they hired an actor, a young actor. Back up one. They hired a young actor, and they, not that one. This gentleman was about 6'2", 6'3", and quite athletic. And they rented a costume, a Hollywood costume, that has made some appearances on a couple of TV commercials. And it was a fairly elaborate costume. It has a rather sophisticated under-armature of muscles sculpted out of foam and then fur that went over. But even given its sophistication, the feet were ridiculously simplistic. They were these loafers, you know, oversized loafers from a thrift store probably, and they had the feet literally glued to them, the fabric, with these floppy toes that stuck up in the air like clown's feet. I mean, literally, you can see Dr. Gamble here walking with them. So we did a number of tests. The goal was simply to see if whether the actor could roughly approximate the gait of the Patterson-Gimlin film subject. And just the angles, in other words. Could he get a gait that looked... And it was remarkable how difficult it was for him to accomplish that. And it took a lot of coaching to get him to the forward lean. The hardest thing was to get him to relax his shoulders, because he would have a tendency to hunch his shoulders up and to have his arms very stiff. And we had to get him to relax so that the arms swung like a natural pendulum. Eventually, after about 45 minutes, he did, but it was very tiring for him, especially holding that 5-degree forward tilt. And that was revealing, because one of the questions she kept saying was, Jessica would ask, well, you know, look at those gluteals. They seem to be tensed most of the step, whereas humans, because of our curvature of the back and our upright posture, the gluteals are only active during the very first part of the step to keep you from jackknifing forward when your heel hits the ground. But these things were rather stiff. And I said, well, look at the stance. I said, if you were leaning 5 degrees forward all the time, you would have tensor gluteals and you would have well-developed muscles here in the lower part of your back, which are very evident on the film. She agreed with that. Anyway, and so we hooked up the reflective balls. And that's why the picture looks so strange. It's infrared illumination. The camera kind of went wild when it took these pictures. But it was a very enlightening illustration. During the exercise, we had projecting on the wall the film clip that was produced by, or put together by M.K. Davis from the frames created by Rick Knoll after the color channel splitting of the digitally scanned images from the film. Okay, what that means is they made a much more enhanced image that subtracted away a lot of the blur and then strung it together to get playing it at the appropriate film speed. And we had that, like I said, projecting up on the wall in a loop as the actor was doing his thing. And so off camera, I'm standing here with Dr. Rose, and they were very receptive, very intrigued and interested by the whole question, but also very, very cautious and conservative in their comments. And she was sticking to the one assignment that she'd accepted, and that was, could they coach an actor to approximate these gait parameters? And the point was, off camera, she's standing here and she's looking back at the wall and she's looking out here, and then she turns to me and she says, "That's obviously a man in a fursuit." And she points to the film clip and she says, I've come to the conclusion that's not a man in a fursuit. And I says, yeah, I'm at that point myself, as a matter of fact. And I said, will you say that on camera? Oh, no. She didn't have tenure yet, for one thing. Bill Munns, at some point, if you have hopefully he will get a lot of this material published soon, and it'll be available in various formats. But Bill Munns, who is a well-known anthropological artist, he does these forensic reconstructions of both living and fossil primates and hominids from the skeleton up. And therefore is extremely versed, and he's worked in Hollywood in costume design and fabrication. He's extremely versed in all of these materials that would be necessary to create such a costume, anything that would approximate what we see on the Patterson Gimlin film subject. Some of you may be privy to the extensive essays he's written, and it's posted on the BFF, the Bigfoot Forum, that are very enlightening and informative. Well, I didn't realize he is also expert in photogrammetry, the science of using measurements of objects in 3D space. Well, actually, the science of taking landmarks from 2D images and creating three-dimensional models. And so using these high-end software that's only available in a commercial setting to an industrial setting to examine the Patterson film subject anew. He plotted landmarks, trees and so forth, stumps, and the creature and so forth, and attempted to recreate a three-dimensional model. But he kept running into a snag. He was using measurements that had been taken by Bob Titmus and John Green at the site very early on, decades ago. And he was also operating under the assumption that the focal length of the camera lens was a 25 millimeter lens. Whenever he did that, the model didn't work. It fell apart on the edges, out toward away from the center. Now, it was funny because in hindsight, it made such perfect sense. I've had the chance of going down to Bluff Creek to the approximate site of the film. It's difficult to identify because so much has changed. But the physical constraints of the little narrow canyon you're in are very evident. And when you're there, compared to the vista that you seem to have when you watch the Patterson film, even realizing that you're zoomed way in on a little tiny bit of the film, it was obvious that it must have been taken with a wider angle lens. Well, he went to the specs for that camera, and sure enough, it came with a standard accessory 15mm lens. So he plugs in the 15mm value, and the computer model suddenly creates a 3D panorama that snaps to all the landmarks, just like that, perfectly. So he said, well, that's it. That explains, too, the feeling of the panorama. Roger, since he was taking a lot of scenery shots at the time, probably had switched out the lens to a 15mm, just had forgot to mention it, or forgot that he'd done that, or whatever. I mean, there was no getting around. It had to be the 15mm lens. Well, that had huge implications, not only for his model, but with the lens focal length known now, with the known height of the subject on the film frame, of given dimensions, 16mm film, knowing the distance to the film subject, the only unknown variable that could easily be solved for with that simple proportionality was the height, the actual height of the film subject. Crunch the numbers and boom, what did he come up with? 7 feet 4 inches. Well, remember when Chris Murphy was arguing on the basis of that stick, that it was 7 feet, and NASA had come up with their own estimate of 7 feet 3 3/4 inches. We all kind of thought that was a little extreme, and it might be a little too precise, given all the parameters. Well, it was darn close to the value that Bill came up with, 7 feet 4 inches tall, plus or minus an inch. As far as I can tell, and I've looked at Bill's report very carefully and gone through, and he gave an excellent in-depth presentation at the Yakima Roundup a few months ago, that conclusion is unassailable. Nobody can say other than the film subject is 7 feet 4 inches tall. So from here on out, anybody who says, oh, it's just a man in a fursuit, doesn't know what they're talking about. They're uninformed, they're ignorant, because that whole argument is out the window. It's not just a man in a fursuit. If it's a man in a fursuit, it's a 7 foot 4 inch tall man in a custom-made suit for a 7 foot 4 individual. And Bill made the point rather strenuously that it would be an extremely unusual undertaking, and everybody in the industry would know about it because the people would be involved. It would be very atypical for someone in 1967 to make a suit that was for a 7 foot 4 inch tall person.
Oh, keep on going.
You sure?
Yeah, Tom said let you have it.
Okay. All right. Well, is there only one? Well, so tomorrow we'll revisit that a little bit. The subject of my talk tomorrow is a review of the Patterson-Gimlin film from the ground up, and we'll take it, bit by bit, work our way right on up, and end up with the discussion of the stature and its implications. So, like I said, this is amazing. This is huge if you stop and think about it, because all these, a lot of the criticism about the Patterson-Gimlin film has rested on the uncertainty of things like the scale. John Napier criticized the film because he thought the feet were ridiculously long for a 6'2" to 6'5" individual, but for a 7'4", they would plug right in, proportional to even human models of foot length, which aren't absolutely applicable in this instance, but nevertheless would have satisfied him had he had that data. And it reconfirms the notions about the film speed and the lower film speed. Other biomechanists that have examined the film have said if it was filmed at 16 or 18 frames per second, Professor Grieve, who's still alive, and for my book, he reiterated his conclusion from 30 years ago that if the film was shot at 16 or 18 frames per second, it could not have been a human in a costume. A human could not have mimicked or have portrayed that particular gait. Is there only one? Where did they come from? Well, of course there's not only one. If it exists, it represents a species. It's not a mysterious solitary monster that's roaming the earth for centuries or millennia. What is it? Well, my working hypothesis, and I spent much of the morning discussing this with John at length, is Gigantopithecus. Here's Bill Munns again with his reconstruction. Now, bear in mind This is not what Gigantopithecus looked like. This is a facsimile of something that is about the size that Gigantopithecus probably achieved. All we know about Gigantopithecus are a couple of teeth like this and a few thousand isolated, a couple of jaws like that and a few thousand isolated teeth. The limb proportions, the hair color, the hair length, hair distribution, facial features, the details of facial features, those are all speculative. Just a speculative reconstruction. But what it does demonstrate, just kind of imagine this blacked out thing. But it still depicts an animal that was of the size that Gigantopithecus achieved. It conveys the notion, better than just a single jaw, that there was an ape that was of these dimensions. The prospect of an 8-foot-tall Sasquatch is not supernatural or extraordinary. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary, I guess you could say, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. There's a precedent, an absolute precedent, just again to indicate the size is.
So from that jaw, we don't even know necessarily that it's bipedal, right?
We don't. Grover made a very extensive argument based on the configuration of the jaw, that its angle of the bodies of the mandible were flared to a degree that suggested that the neck was up underneath the head and between the jaw rather than coming out from behind the head and behind the jaws. And so that argument has some merit. There's some flaws, some weaknesses rather, I should say flaws, some weaknesses, but nevertheless, as I was discussing with John, on the other hand too, you have to bear in mind that if you're an 800 to 1,000 pound ape and you're in temperate forests rather than tropical forests, there aren't very many trees that are going to support you, or would you have much motivation to go up in a tree? You're going to be very terrestrial. There's no fruit up there. The fruits are down in the understory in a temperate forest, coniferous forest, and so forth. So once you're restricted to the ground, you can either walk on all fours or you can walk on two legs. And because of the configuration, the reason, one of the hypotheses for the evolution of human bipedalism is that because of our ape heritage, in which our shoulder blades no longer line up with our upper extremity, rather it's at an angle to it. So instead of the shoulder blades like in a cow or a horse lining up with the upper arm bone like this, so the joint is in compression, which it tolerates very well, the broad, narrow back of an ape brings the shoulder blade onto the back of the rib cage. So now the shoulder joint's oriented like this when you drop down to all fours. So that puts the joint in shear. The tendency is to drive the head of the shoulder blade past the shoulder joint of the shoulder blade. I don't know if I said that right. The tendency is to drive the humerus past the shoulder blade. So the head of the humerus past the glenoid of the shoulder blade. And so to limit that shearing pressure, apes like monkeys or chimps and gorillas actively retract their body weight onto their back legs to spare the forelimbs that extra weight. So if you put a force plate on the ground here, or just a scale, and have them stand with their hind feet on a scale and the front legs on the scale, you wouldn't see the body weight divided evenly. You'd see much more of the body weight on the back legs. The point simply being that tendency predisposes the organisms to stand upright. This is why chimpanzees and gorillas are very capable of standing upright for short periods of time. So the point is that Gigantopithecus, with its even more massive weight, it would be much more logical for it to become bipedal than it would be to remain down on all fours, given its shoulder rearrangement. So, but we'll never know that for sure until we find some postcranial skeletal remains of the Gigantopithecus. All right. So one other point that I wanted to make, and this was, again, it was made all too obvious in this book that I reviewed. Yes, sir. The species Gigantopithecus blacki goes back to a little bit before, about 1.2 to 1.5 million years ago, and extends up to as recently as 300,000 years ago. You know, I've seen in print somebody speculated a figure 200,000 years ago. But the genus goes back as far as 5 million years ago, and the smaller species are found over here in Indo-Pakistan, in the foothills of the Himalayas. And then it expanded its range, the genus, you know, members of the genus expanded their range. And Gigantopithecus evolved during the very latter part of the Pliocene into the Pleistocene, attained its gigantism during the Pleistocene, when other mammalian lineages likewise became very gigantic, like the mammoths and rhinoceros and cave bears and so forth. All in northerly latitudes, by the way. So it's another indication that maybe Gigantopithecus is one of these Pleistocene expressions of gigantism representing the ape family or class or family.
So you give it a different family line than say a hominid. You wouldn't call it a hominid.
I wouldn't call it a hominid, no. And it gets confusing sometimes too, without a good understanding of the history. In some of the early writings about Gigantopithecus, because it was discovered to have very thick molar enamel, it was thought that maybe it was a hominid, maybe it was a human ancestor, a human relative even. And Weidenreich created this elaborate theory that human lineage had gone through a giant phase, and these ancestors, these giant, like Meganthropus and Gigantopithecus were our ancestors. We now know that all of the apes, the majority of the apes at that time, including the hominids, had thick molar enamel. And so it's just one other type of ape.
Wouldn't you say, though, I'll give it an Australopithecus with us, I call it Paranthropus.
Paranthropus, right?
I've read, sent an email to them. Just take that species, perhaps, and it showed them in the past that this Australopithecus group was evolving toward larger size, and they lived for a long time. You make that even larger, which that species,
right,
that group even larger, and given the time that they've been given, which they've given plenty of time, you've got Bigfoot.
Yeah, exactly. You could. The only missing link in that theory is that our only known paranthropoids. Would you hit that back button? Just the back arrow button. Oh, you can do it that way too, but just hit the back arrow button. There you go. The only Paranthropus fossils we have are right here. So we've got a giant ape that is in the right place at the right time, much closer. I mean, not only do you have the geographic gap, but you have the temporal gap. We don't have any specimens that are younger than 2.5 million years, 2 million years of Paranthropus. But now, things could change. Just a couple weeks ago, we were talking about this earlier out there, just a couple weeks ago, a new specimen of Homo erectus was found in the Soviet Republic of Georgia that predates the African Homo erectus now. So now the only way to account for that then is either our dates are way off and Homo erectus evolved earlier than we thought, although there's an absence of fossil record, and then migrated out earlier, much earlier, or that the Australopithecines were actually spreading earlier into the old world, evolved into Homo erectus here, and re-expanded their range back into Africa at a younger date, about 1.8 million years ago. Now, an interesting thing in that line is that Rush Shahan, who's written a lot about Gigantopithecus, also drew attention to a little piece of maxilla which has its closest comparison to an Australopithecine, found over here in China, where there supposedly have never been. And the discussion now about Homo floresiensis is that it has the greatest affinities not to Homo erectus, but to Australopithecines. See, when I first reviewed the paper that came out in Nature, I wrote a review for another journal, and in looking at their description, they ignored any description of the hands and feet, which would be the most telling parts, because they were trying to push their idea that it was Homo. And I said, how can you have Homo with the brain size of a chimpanzee? Look at these tibia, they look just like chimpanzee tibias. This is that has a flary pelvis like an Australopithecine. And people were saying, what? Well, now at the last physical anthropology meetings, what are they saying? This looks like it could be a remnant Australopithecine. So if there's a remnant Australopithecine that survived until only 13,000 years ago here, there was apparently a wave of Australopithecines that made it out. And so if that gets more volume, more substantial fossil evidence, then a hypothesis of a robust form becoming giant could well bear out in the fossil record.
I'd like to see what one of these faces look like. Does it have a flat nose, like an ape, or does it have
Faces faces of which?
Of Bigfoot.
Oh, a Bigfoot. Well,
does it have a flat nose, or does it have?
Well, it depends on which witness you talk to, which artistic rendering.
Septum, does it have lips?
Yeah. Well, I'll show you some attempts to squeeze as much detail out of the Patterson-Gimlin image as possible that have been conducted by Owen Caddy, and show you his end result and see what you think of that by comparison to some of the other. Harvey Pratt's done some very interesting drawings based on eyewitness depictions or recollections of what they saw, and they vary. There's some that look extremely human. There's some that look extremely ape-like in their configuration. But the point I wanted to make here before we leave this is this expansion into North America. This same author whose book I'm reviewing has this ridiculous paragraph that says, okay, now as far as Gigantopithecus, getting from Asia to North America, picture this, and then here's his description: a breeding-sized group of giant apes walking, or giant bamboo-eating quadrupedal apes dragging themselves tens of thousands of miles through arid, frozen wasteland populated by very hungry people, only to arrive in North America and face the Pleistocene extinction of of large mammals due to the overkill hypothesis or whatever. I mean, he's alluding to that. But that's a pretty close paraphrase of what he says. Bamboo-eating, knuckle-walking, dragging themselves through a coal-barren wasteland. Well, that's an absolutely 100% ignorant statement. He didn't do his homework. Number one, the best evidence does not characterize Gigantopithecus as a bamboo eater. It may have eaten some grasses, but the study on which that is based looked at 4 molars, of which one had phytoliths that Rashomon never bothered to identify the species. Their phytoliths are these little minerals that are in grasses or grasses. They're either silicate or in this case they're opaline, and they're there to resist the browsers from overbrowsing, or the grazers from overgrazing on the grasses. So he doesn't know if they were bamboo. The much more elaborate study that was conducted on microwear analysis of the occlusal surfaces of the molars of Gigantopithecus showed that it had teeth that had wear patterns most similar to the diets of chimpanzees. Not even gorillas, but chimpanzees. They were omnivores. They ate everything. We don't know if they were knuckle walkers, or if they were quadrupeds, or if they were bipeds. And more fundamentally, at the times they were crossing, it wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a contiguous forest, at times of mixed coniferous and deciduous trees that extended from central China all the way into British Columbia. It was one habitat. So you didn't have to have massive groups of Sasquatch migrating tens of thousands of miles. Over the course of a 1.5 million years, you had them expanding their home range through a contiguous habitat from point A to point B. Just a natural expansion. Now, if a red panda that was a cohort of Gigantopithecus, a little red panda, mask, raccoon-looking panda, could expand its range and leave fossil teeth that have been found in Washington State and in Alabama, why not a Gigantopithecus? You know, it's just, so this is a major chapter in my next book that's coming along, as to revisit this ridiculous misconception that's been perpetuated time and time again. The other thing to bear in mind is when we look, especially here in recent time, when we back up, for a long time there was a paradigm, sort of a rule of thumb that prevailed, that hominids were so specialized, it was such an unusual adaptation, that there could be only one. Remember, isn't that the theme of Highlander? There can be only one, you know what I mean? No Highlander fans out there? Okay. Well, that has been thrown out the window, because it's now clearly recognized that at any given slice of geologic time in the hominid fossil record, there were many, many species. 3, 4, 5, probably even more if our sampling fossil record is as spotty as we believe it is compared to other animals that are in the fossil record. So, for example, we have Homo erectus now that have been found way up until as recently as about 34 or 35,000 years ago. We have specimens of Homo heidelbergensis. This was our immediate ancestor. But we have, well, I was over in China looking at some fossil foot bones of a much earlier Homo heidelbergensis, the only specimen that provides a complete pair of foot skeletons. I went over to the museum to look at some of the specimens that were on display, and they said, and when you get there, take a hard right and look at the display case there. Well, there's this fossil skeleton from a site called Yashu, which is 13 miles outside of Beijing, right downtown Beijing. And they found a beautifully preserved specimen, which they dated to 12,000 years old. And it's a Homo heidelbergensis. It has these big, heavy brow ridges, thick bones, gigantic femurs. I mean, it's a very robust specimen of this species. 12,000 years ago. Then you have Homo neanderthalensis in Europe. We know they survived up until about 23,000 years ago. And then now we can add to this Homo floresiensis that came down here 13,000 years ago. And Homo sapiens appeared 200,000 years ago. So say we took a slice here, just say 50,000 years ago. Here's 5 hominids that were existing. And this isn't taking into account if the possible existence of Bigfoot and so forth. But maybe this is the Almasti, here's the orangutan. Who knows? Who knows? So it would be odd to think that now was the exception, with only a single hominid represented on the face of the planet, as opposed to in times past.
You just keep on going.
Okay. Don't be bashful about getting up and leaving heaven. Are they merely apes, or are they more human? Well, one enthusiastic researcher, who I'll spare naming, on a radio talk show said he had this very detailed account by an eyewitness, and as the Bigfoot was walking away, it turned and grinned at him. Therefore, and since we know that humans are the only animals that can grin, they must be human. Well, I beg to differ. Other primates can grin and grimace and bare their teeth, draw their mouth back. Others have made a big deal about Patty's appendages, Patty's breasts, and say, well, only modern humans have breasts, therefore Sasquatch must be human. Well, I think she would beg to differ. Okay? Lactating great apes have dimensions that would cause envy in a lot of modern humans. I think when people who have never had the opportunity, either in a zoo setting or more particularly in a setting where, like I've had the privilege of being right up there in the same enclosure with great apes, to interact with them on that level, that eye contact, and when you can see what's going on in their minds, and the cleverness and the awareness. When you see their facial expression and the expressivity of their eyes, I can imagine a witness not appreciating those distinctions, seeing a Sasquatch for the first time, and thinking, my gosh, this is a human, this is a person. There's a personality behind those eyes, you know. And that doesn't surprise me. That doesn't make them human, though. When we look at the hominid fossil record, from the first appearance of the genus Homo 2 million years ago, it is accompanied with a material culture. The thing that distinguishes Homo from pre-Homo is the presence of tools, of stone tools that are preserved in the fossil record and used in a consistent, replicable way, not in an opportunistic way. So here's a depiction of a Cro-Magnon man, and it's a little artistic license. The bow and arrow are probably a little premature, but the stuff, you know, I mean, George Carlin fans, one of his famous routines was stuff. We're unusual and funny in the way we have to keep our stuff and we put it here. We go on vacation, we take our most sacred stuff and we put it in our suitcases, take it with us, so on and so on. Well, what's missing over here? There's no stuff. There's no stuff, and all of the reports, whether it's leaning sticks, whether it's cairns, whether it's tree knocks, whether it's any other behavior that's been reported, can all be readily accommodated in as slight variations on what's already been observed for other known great apes, their anatomy as well as behavior. So if they are people, they are very different people, a very different approach to life than the human lineage has displayed for the past 2 million years. Also, the appearance of the relative proportions of the face to the cranium. This thing, I'll just say thing, this individual exhibits, and Grover was quick to point this out too, a cranial capacity that's on par for what one would expect of an animal of that mass. An animal, a gorilla of that mass, a chimpanzee of that mass. Not a human by any means. And in fact, Bill Munns, again, if you ever have a chance, one of the other interesting things he did was he did some reconstruction trying to determine the accuracy of his impressions of the image, the film subject's head profile in various orientations. And he demonstrates that if you try to put a human head in that figure, in that costume, it doesn't fit. Because if the eyes are anywhere close to the eye openings, what would be eye openings if it were a costume, the forehead gets cut off. So you'd have to find somebody who has essentially no frontal lobes to speak of in order to fit into the costume. Where are the bones, the physical evidence? Well, of course, you know, if you have experience in the wild, you know how quickly nature takes care of decomposing remains, both through biotic processes, the decomposers and scavengers, and then what's left, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm not as familiar with the soil chemistry here, but with our volcanic soils and coniferous forests, the soils are very acidic, and bone just doesn't last very long. Bone that doesn't get immediately processed by rodents and porcupines is very quickly deteriorates. And so even though there are tens of thousands of deer carcasses out there from kills and winter starvation and so forth, you don't stumble on very many deer skeletons when you go out on hikes in the springtime. Just not much to speak of. If Sasquatch is an ape, has a long life expectancy, reproduces very infrequently, given his body size has a few natural predators, a death is going to be an extremely rare event in a very rare population. Very few numbers. And so an animal that has no natural predators, that dies a natural death, will usually secrete itself off in some nook or cranny, and the chance of its bones being scattered out somewhere where they're going to be readily found by a hiker or a recreationist is pretty slim. I've taught, the place we might find skeletal remains would be in caves, particularly limestone caves where the alkaline environment would be conducive to preserving the bone. And that's the only place we find bones of Gigantopithecus, for example. That's why their remains are so rare. The only remains we have of Gigantopithecus are from bones that have been dragged into limestone caves by porcupines. Every Gigantopithecus tooth has all of the roots and the dentin chewed away by porcupines. The jaws show porcupine gnawing, taking off all the thin parts and leaving just the thickest parts here in the sides and the front. If it weren't for those porcupines dragging into the caves, there'd be no fossil record for Gigantopithecus. Okay. While I was over in China visiting with Dr. Zhou Gujing, I asked him, when we were filming for Monster Quest, he brought out a box of Gigantopithecus teeth that he'd excavated from the central part of China in Hubei. And I said, Dr. Gujing, are there any caves with vertebrate fossil remains north of Hubei in China that you're aware of that might have sampled Gigantopithecus distributions into more northerly latitudes? He thought for a moment, he said, no, as a matter of fact, there aren't. So the fossil record and its the inferred distribution of Gigantopithecus is completely biased by where there happen to be limestone caves, period. And we could have Gigantopithecus up in the northern latitudes to a much greater extent than has been recognized. These were caves in southeastern Alaska, sealed caves, and therefore the remains were pretty preserved. You can see this remarkable articulated skeleton of the bear here, and yet for the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years that bears have been coming and going, we only have a few examples of these that I could account for. And I talked with another paleontologist who specializes in the excavation of caves in southeastern Alaska, and he said they only have maybe a half a dozen bits and pieces of bear remains from the fossils that he's excavated. And yet the bears den in there, they live in there, they drag their food into there, and yet they're very poorly represented even under those conditions. Few people realize that as far as chimpanzees go, there is no fossil record in Africa of chimpanzees, with the exception of these teeth that were discovered 3 years ago and attributed to direct ancestry to chimpanzees. So for the presumably 5 to 7 million years that chimpanzees have been in Africa since the divergence from the last common ancestor with humans, this is all we have to show for chimpanzee evolution. And yet no one questions the existence of chimpanzees because we don't have any fossils of chimpanzees, right? Of course, maybe that's a little bit of a silly retort, but nevertheless. We do have a hair, and as you may know, Dr. Henner Fehrenbach is retired, but he has examples of 15 independent cases that are fairly confidently attributed to Sasquatch because they're distinct from other common wildlife and apes, and yet they show consistent characteristics that unite them all together. So since Henner now enjoys much more looking through his telescope at the stars than he does through a microscope looking at the hair, just before I left I placed an order for a comparison microscope setup, and I'm going to try to kind of take that baton and start encouraging others to referee my conclusions or my observations and try to get a paper published so we get some discussion. The curious thing is, hair identification is apparently becoming a dying art, and finding someone who's willing to look at these hair samples that Henner has accumulated from a professional capacity is extremely difficult. There's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Forensic Lab in Ashland, Oregon, but they will only look at specimens that are involved in a litigation. So maybe if somebody wants to sue for the identity of one of these hair samples, or pretend that you poached something, we might be able to get an identification. So what do other scientists think about my research and book? And this is not to toot my horn, this is just to say mine isn't the lone voice in the wilderness, although it seems that way sometimes. There are other very accomplished, credentialed scientists, much more so than myself, who are at my back, you could say. And Dr. Schaller was very gracious enough to write the foreword to my book, and he appeared in the documentary as well. Had the good fortune of Russ Midmeyer providing an endorsement in conjunction with the book and another project that we took. So this is the president of one of the leading international conservation societies. He's also the chairman of the IUCN Committee on the Primate Specialty Group for Endangered Species. And then, of course, the book also touts an endorsement by Jane Goodall, and sorry about the typing there, got a little skewed. But Dr. Goodall has been very nice in coming sort of out with her interests. She first came out on NPR when a caller surreptitiously posed the question what she thought about Sasquatch, and before the moderator could react, she responded, and responded very affirmatively. And so one thing led to another, and I was able, sort of on the heels of that, I took the bold step of sending a manuscript copy of my book to her for a read, and you can imagine she gets requests like that a lot. So I was tickled beyond description when she agreed to write it and wrote a very nice endorsement. And then when I was at the Willow Creek Museum to scan those footprint casts, she happened to be scheduled to speak at Humboldt State University, just down the hill, down off the mountain. And so we were trying to coordinate a little bit. They wanted me to try to get her to come up to the museum for a visit, to publicize the museum collection a little bit. But her schedule was always so tight, it wasn't possible. She turned around and invited me to come down. So after she gave an enthralling presentation, everyone races up to get in line to have their books, her books, copies of her books signed by her. And it's quite a well-oiled machine. I managed to slip in and only had to wait about 45 minutes, but they were there until midnight having books signed. She's really dedicated. But I was a little sheepish because instead of an armful of her books, I had 3 copies of my book under my arm. And as we got up close, her assistant, her name's Mary, who was working the table, and I mean, they get you all set up so that she can sign these books, and then they've got the nice backdrop, and they actually take the picture for you and then post it on the internet. You can download copies and so on. Like I said, very well. But Mary saw me and recognized me and said, "Oh, Jeff." They were very happy to see me, and when Jane was busy signing, she overheard Mary, and she looked down around the line, and so we started talking, and she asks, "So how's the book doing?" And before I could say anything, Mary pipes up, "Oh, it's doing great guns. Every time I Google your name, his book comes up." So here's her signature. So I've got, so in a few years, I figure if my funding ever cuts out, I'm going to take one of those copies and put it on eBay and hope we can get a good return to keep the research going. So with that, I'll stop. Bye.
Join the Mid-America Bigfoot Research Center on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. for the Bigfoot Field Guide radio show. For more information, go to the Mid-America Bigfoot Research Center's website at www.mid-americabigfoot.com. Listen to the hosts talk about everything Bigfoot, from behaviors to current research being conducted in the field. It's all there, and also check out the archives at www.talkshoe.com/tc/10072 and tell them that Bigfoot sent you. See ya there.